Well, thanks. This year I don't have to be here pushing you all to get out there and fight hard for our long-term surface transportation bill. We got one. That's good. Yay. We beat back the devolutionists, but they're not totally gone. We beat back those who would say that we should only invest in highways and not in transit. We got a decent bill, so now that we've all given ourselves a round of applause, let's start working. We got a lot of work to do. I'm going to look ahead instead of back because we're all familiar with what we got in that bill. We still didn't solve financing, obviously. The bill was financed with $70 billion of delusional pretend and otherwise dubious offsets. For instance, this will now be the third time that Congress has authorized private tax collection. And of course, the last two times it was wildly unpopular. And secondly, it lost money. But this time it's going to make money, sure. On and on. Listen, probably the only real thing is the money that we're going to take from the Federal Reserve account, which of course they just make up money with computers, so we're just taking some money from them that they made up anyway. So that's the most real offset we're getting. We obviously have not solved the financing issue, and that's work ahead of us. When we look ahead to the next projected bill, instead of having to fill a $70 billion pothole, it'll be a $113 billion pothole, and that's just for continuing current level expenditures, which, as you all know, are not adequate. Last time I checked, our deferred investment in bringing our transit systems up to a state of good repair was around $80 billion. And that's not to mention, of course, the 140,000 bridges on the national highway system that need repair or replacement, the 40% of the highway system itself, which is beyond the point of resurfacing where you need to rebuild the roadbed. And I could go on and on. But obviously, this bill is it's better than what the House proposed. It's slightly better than we were at. In particular, we did well with buses. Having suffered a horrible loss in the last highway bill, but we have to look for a long-term solution. Last time we raised the gas tax, 1993, the federal government was taking 18.3 cents, and gas was a little over $1 a gallon. Last year, of course, gas got over $4 a gallon. We're still taking 18.3 cents, but most Americans don't realize that. They think a lot of that money is going into investments in transportation infrastructure. It's taxation. We have to educate people on what a tiny fraction does go there, and that's an ongoing issue. Here in Washington, D.C., when we considered the bill, we had a relatively open process for a change. We were the first bill on the floor after Ryan became Speaker. And so we spent 2 days on the floor, had, I think, 92 amendments. That's the good news. The bad news is there were dozens of proposed amendments on funding, not a single one of which was allowed to be voted upon. I think maybe they're afraid one or another of them might pass because there is a growing realization that we're underinvesting. Be that as it may, I did get a provision in the bill which is essentially a reopener. It's got a much more, it's got a bizarre name I can't even remember at the moment. But it says that if additional funds at any point during this bill are made available for transportation, they will flow through the formulas in this bill. No further consideration by Congress will be necessary. So if sometime in the next 5 years we can bring Congress to its senses and get legislation through that increases funding, as a number of all red states have done in the last year, then it'll just go through the current formulas in the bill. That's good. But beyond that, we've got to begin to think of other ways to fund it. You all come from a diversity of states. We put $95 million in this bill which is going to be fast-tracked. Probably by the end of this month, DOT is going to put out requests for proposal for states that want to look at innovative ways of funding transportation. They will be giving out grants out of that $95 million. And I would urge each and every one of you to go to your home jurisdictions and say, hey, you know, the federal government is looking for states that want to look at innovative financing. Are we applying? Why aren't we applying? Let's apply, or you know, pushing them forward. You know, we've looked at VMT in Oregon in a very limited way. You know, that holds some promise for the future. There are still issues extant, particularly privacy. You know, you heard earlier, I heard from my colleague Earl Blumenauer. Now, the first experiment was in Earl's district. And in Earl's district, a very, very liberal, urban, mostly district, you know, the liberals are very happy to have the government know where they are at every moment, makes them feel good. In my district, you know, in the rural areas, you know, they're not quite so enthralled with the idea of the government knowing where you are at all times so that they can track your mileage. Beyond that, there are real equity issues. You know, you can't have a flat, in my opinion, you can't have a flat VMT, because what is the burden that, you know, a rancher out in eastern Oregon who has to drive 20 miles to the feed store is putting on the system versus someone who jumps on 205 in Portland at rush hour? You're going to have variable pricing, congestion pricing, which means you have to be able to track people. But then people have to, you know, it gets very complicated. But I think there are ways to solve it, and we need the states to be the laboratories as we move forward. There are other ways to raise funds. I was just thrilled that President Obama, only 8 years after I proposed it, or 7.5, has supported my barrel tax. Of course, it's a little late now. But the idea would be we could even do away with the retail gas tax and go to a barrel tax, taxing only the fraction of a barrel of oil that goes into taxable transportation uses. Not going to take on any new fights. We're not going to take on the farmers. We're not going to take on home heating oil or anybody else, or manufacturers are going to say, no, we're only going to tax the fraction that comes out of the refinery that goes into taxable transportation uses. It's a very easy tax to collect. It moves the tax upstream. And economists say, you know, that's interesting, because the way oil markets work with the speculators and the imports and all this, it might be that if you tax that far upstream, that the industry and the refiners could not that easily pass through every penny of the cost to people at the pump or to truckers at the pump. So I think that holds a lot of promise. There are other alternatives out there, simple indexation, which have also proposed, and then dedicate, and you would index both to construction cost inflation and to fleet fuel economy, so that you've got a double index, which nobody understands, which is always good in Washington when you can't understand the formula. But it also, you know, over time, you could project it. Ray LaHood was a big fan of this when I proposed this. And back then, when interest rates were virtually zero, they aren't that much higher now, he figured out that we could have, with double indexation and the projections for those two inflation factors, that we could have borrowed about $120 billion, put it in the trust fund on day one of the bill, and paid it back in about 13 years. Today, it'd probably take you 16 years. But you're not alienating any of the rest of the gas tax, and that has potential too. So, you know, we need to look at these alternatives. Some states have gone to wholesale taxes or hybrid wholesale taxes. Others are thinking or looking at VMT. You know, let's get the states to experiment and then hopefully push along the Congress. But there are also still some devolutionists to be dealt with. We saw a few votes on the floor on transit and on the overall bill that were disturbing. So I challenge you, particularly if you are in a smaller city or providing rural transit, or someplace where you've got a devolutionist or Tea Party member, invite them to come along for a ride and show them that this is not just a big city project. This is not just the blue state urban areas that are benefiting from this transit funding. I think you know, you could change some minds. You could also talk to them about interesting things. There's been a couple of great articles about how people living in more remote suburbs where it's cheaper, how many bus rides or changes they have to take to get to their jobs. Well, they want to get people off welfare, but if people can't get to work, what's the default? So I think there's some interesting arguments we can make to try and bring along the devolutionists. So, we've also got to look at the issue of, back during MAP 21, we saw a wedge that was driven. So that's the second thing. You got to deal with the Tea Party people, but we've also got to be cautious and look out for those who would drive a wedge between the big legacy systems and everybody else in America who needs transit funding. So you've also got to be looking at some of the people who have participated in that when we did the MAP 21 bill, and also get them out on your systems and talk about how, well, yeah, we're a big urban area, but guess what? We're fed by all these other systems that come in out of the suburbs, and you can't just talk about the legacy system here. You have to talk about everything that feeds us and brings the people in. We've got to educate people into the entirety of the need for transit, that it is not just a big blue state, urban, liberal issue. So that's one challenge I would leave you with today. And then the other issue that we fought hard in this bill, and I think it'll soon bear fruit, and I just want to reinforce, is we did increase the percentage of required domestic content made in America. These are tax dollars paid by Americans. I had a lot of pushback from some of the manufacturers saying, oh, we can't possibly do that. Well, given the amount of money we're going to spend on buses in the next 5 years, they're going to find a way to do it. It's convenient and easy for them to keep making the stuff somewhere else, maybe a little bit cheaper, but it can be done here. It can be done here, and it's going to be done here. That was a pretty modest proposal. There were others who'd like to go to 100%, and I think someday we will get to 100%. But at this point, we've just got to fulfill the promise of moving up to 70%. That's going to provide real jobs, which is still something that is in sore need of across America. So, I'm already thinking about how we're going to move forward, not just waiting till 3 years out or 4 years out and saying, oh, now it's time to get into gear for the next reauthorization. No, we got to start today on the next reauthorization. We got to start on the funding. We got to start on enlightened policy. We've got to work on those who I serve with who are not yet believers in the entirety of the need for federal investment in this system, and we've got to show them how this benefits all Americans, not just those in certain areas. We've got allies in this fight. Certainly those of you who represent larger urban districts, with the development community and others, there are many folks we can bring into this fight as we go forward. So that's my challenge to you for today. Thanks. Have a good conference, and I'll take a few questions if you wish. Oh, I have a question. Oh, you don't need a microphone. The next guy, don't give him the microphone. Just let him talk. So, any questions? Great. Okay, good. I'm done then. All right, thanks.